really excited about this talk. So I'll start just introducing a little bit. Um, so hi everyone. The Conversaciones Abiertas or Open Conversations IG live series, which is a series on Latina mental health, continues for the month of May, which is Mental Health Awareness Month. And today we're going to dive into ADHD in the Latina community. Um, just to briefly kind of share about ADHD, and so we're all on the same page. ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, which is a neurodevelopmental condition that impacts people's ability to focus, people's ability to juggle different tasks at the same time. It also shows up in people's ability to regulate their emotions and impulses. It shows up in people's energy levels as well. And it has three subtypes, which are ADHD that's inattentive, which is the one that you may struggle focusing or you may be distractible, and hyperactive, which refers to the energy levels and impulsivity as well, or combined, which is combined with inattentive or hyperactive. And so now that I've just kind of shared and we're all on the same page about ADHD, I am so excited that my colleague, Dr. Janice Castro, is joining us. And we're going to take a little bit of time to introduce ourselves. So Dr. Janice Castro is specialized in ADHD. And if you can share more with our viewers, Janice, a little bit about your work and what's inspired you to work with the ADHD community.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so grateful for us to be in this space having these conversations. So I am a licensed psychologist in California, originally from the DMV area, which is what we have in common, right? We both used to live in Maryland. So aside from being a licensed psychologist, I am a small business owner of JC Psychological Services, where I do speaking engagements, and I am also a podcast host. And what really inspired me to want to do the work that I do specifically with the ADHD community is I recognize I don't have ADHD. I'm neurotypical, and so I always try to humble myself and recognizing the privilege that I carry with that, and knowing that I may not 100% understand the experience. And yet, what I feel deeply connected to are the feelings of navigating spaces that weren't built for people like myself, being a Latina, first gen professional, especially when I've attended like predominantly white institutions for all of my schooling, like all my college experience. And that also leading me to feel like I'm masking. Like I'm constantly code switching in different spaces where I feel like I could be myself, but then there's spaces where I couldn't be myself, and how exhausting it is. And then also experiencing the imposter phenomenon, feeling like I'm not working hard enough, I can't keep up with others, as well as navigating a lot of burnout throughout my life. Because the imposter phenomenon, feeling like I'm not good enough, I need to work harder, is what challenged me to, experience the burnout multiple times throughout my life and my career. And I think those experiences have led me to really deeply resonate with the experience of adults with ADHD. And I feel inspired to want to be able to help this community, especially given my privilege. And I want to be able to amplify the voices of marginalized communities, because I come from a training program throughout grad school that was social justice oriented. Part of social justice is being able to advocate for those marginalized communities, even the ones that I may not identify with, but that get overlooked.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love how you feel deeply connected to the ADHD community, even though you haven't gone through it yourself, but you connect in an empathic way, and you understand, right, what it is to mask in different settings and how difficult it can be for the ADHD community um, to operate in neurotypical environments and feel as though that they would need to mask, right? So just to share a little bit more about what inspired me as well to work with the ADHD community. I by the way, I'm Katie Pura, and I am the founder of Child Haven Counseling, which is a practice that specializes in working with children, teens, and young adults. Um, and I work with ADHD youth. And what I feel deeply connected to them because I have ADHD. And growing up, ADHD was not something I was aware about or that was talked about like in conversations in school or anything like that. I went to a private school, and it was a very rigorous private school. It was a bilingual private school in Honduras. And I learned English. Well, Spanish is my first language, but I learned English at a very young age. And a lot of our classes were very rigorous, and it was a lot, to deal with. But I always enjoyed school. So I did well in school. However, I would get distracted, or I would forget things, or I would, act clumsily, so to speak, which to now I understand as lack of spatial awareness, right? Like that a lot of the ADHD, some ADHD, some people who have ADHD may struggle with spatial awareness, which means their ability to really see what's in their surroundings. So I would fall, I would bump myself often, and the way I was labeled made me feel like there was something wrong with me, right? Like I was labeled as clumsy or tú no eres chispa, meaning you're not alert. And I always like internalized that growing up. And so because I internalized that, I didn't want to be that. And so I masked the symptoms, and I did well in school. I got through, high school, college, all of that. So it wasn't until I majored in the mental health field that I started learning about ADHD. And I remember just seeing the symptomology and feeling deeply connected to that and realizing, wait, this whole time I have had ADHD and no one told me about it. No one guided me about it. And I don't really necessarily blame my parents. I think they just didn't have the tools, they didn't have the information. This is why these open conversations are being had, right? Because mental health is not often talked about, let alone ADHD. And so that really inspired me to help youth who struggle with ADHD and help families understand their children with the lens of empathy and compassion rather than you are misbehaved. Um, and so that brings me to our next point, Janice, that why do you think it's important for us to talk about ADHD in the Latina community?
Yeah. I think it's really important for us to talk about it. One, because when it comes to mental health, there is still a very big stigma, right? And so, just when it comes to any type of emotional, mental well being, it's really hard for us to have the words to describe what we're going through and be able to communicate it to others as well, right? Because we live with relationships, and our mental and emotional well-being can impact our relationships, and it can be really challenging, especially when I think about, for example, those of us who are children of immigrants, or for those who are immigrants themselves. Being able to talk to our parents about mental health can be really challenging because culturally we think about how any type of medication or doctor visits that are not connected to physical health all of a sudden are interpreted as eso es para los locos, that's for crazy people. And I think because of that stigma, when we also consider that layer of having a disability, especially one that's invisible, because you can't tell when somebody has ADHD physically, then it makes it really challenging for people to understand what is that? What do you mean? What is like I think in our community because of the stigma with mental health, disability that is invisible, it's like, well, you don't look sick or you don't look like you're struggling, so just keep going, right? And I think that it can feel a little bit complicated because as a community, I think we have such beautiful values when it comes to humility. When we think about the experience of being very hardworking people in society, and échale ganas, like keep going, which is great. I think that's what really makes us very resilient, um, and we persevere. That's in us. And also, when you're struggling with an invisible disability or mental health isn't visibly present, mentally and emotionally we're struggling, and we don't know how to ask for help. When we think about ADHD, it impacts so many different areas of one's life. It impacts your relationships, it impacts how you communicate in your relationships, whether it's you forgot to call up your friend or you haven't responded to that text in months, or you forgot that you had planned an event with a friend and then you're running late, or even in like romantic relationships, not just friendships, or your relationship with your parents, or how you're working at work or at school. All of these different areas of one's life get impacted by ADHD. If you don't have a system in place, it can feel like you're working harder, not smarter. And so I think that given all of the impact that ADHD has, when we look at it from a cultural lens, I think that it can very much get dismissed. And then what ends up happening is that it gets overlooked. A lot of people in our community will overcompensate for it, which then leads to a lot of burnout, a lot of imposter phenomenon. And then for those who get diagnosed as an adult, then there's this grief of like, well, damn, like how life would have been different if I knew sooner, and the help that I could have gotten before. But because in our community we don't really talk about mental health, everybody's just kind of pushing forward with their unique mental and emotional struggles.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like this element of struggle is silent, right? It's almost like, all right, well, no estés triste, right? Because there's a brighter tomorrow, or let's pray
Mm,
about it and
yeah.
let's just keep going, which in a way the essence of that is resiliency and hope, which is great, but at the same time it dismisses when someone is truly struggling, when someone has ADHD.
Yeah.
Yes, they could look at the bright side, or be happy the next day, but they're on their day-to-day lives, they are dealing with this that's very hard to talk about. And I think what makes it even more stigmatizing is that, in the Latina community, oftentimes the ADHD symptomology is labeled as you are misbehaving, right? So
Yeah.
you are the bad kid, or
Mm,
you need discipline, or you need to fix this about you, right?
mm,
And it really dismisses the fact that this is an actual condition that
yeah.
needs treatment, right? That yes, yeah, there are behavioral changes that a person who has ADHD can make, but sometimes it's this like nature versus nurture thing, right? Sometimes there are these things that are hard to find, like, I mean, hard to, sorry, change,
Mm,
like the executive functioning, right? With ADHD, people have executive functioning deficiency. So it's not, a person with ADHD is not making, is not, what is it called? Doing the things that they do on
right.
purpose. It really is hard to manage. Like, a person with ADHD needs the tools, needs support, right? Um, and Go ahead. Sorry, Janice.
No, I was just agreeing with you. You know, I think that if in our community we're labeling it as like, oh, like, you know, ella es distraída, o ella siempre ha sido así, un poco floja, or, you know, he's just like that. Or if only he would apply himself, then maybe he could reach his fullest potential. Those kinds of messages that people get, especially when we think about at school or from family, ends up turning it into like it's a you problem. Like if only you would be different, or if you could keep up and work harder, then you would be better. And then hearing those messages throughout your life, and on top of that, being already from this marginalized group of being a minority in the US, it leads to those self-critical talks. It leads to like, yeah, like what is wrong with me? Why can't I do better? Why can't I focus? Why can't I, you know, try harder? And that shame can lead to more mental health concerns like experiencing depression or anxiety. And then it gets tricky because then you're not only just trying to figure out how to manage your ADHD. Now, on top of that, you've got depressive or anxiety symptoms. But because we don't talk about mental health at home and we're told to like, échale ganas, sigue adelante, ponte las pilas, then it's just continuous struggles throughout life.
And continuous silent struggles, right? Because if I'm being told you need to fix this about you, why am I going to show you that I'm struggling?
Yeah.
Right? Like that can make it harder with someone who has ADHD to come forward and say, wait, I need help. Like I have tried this or I have tried that, right? I need guidance. Um, and it leads to those symptoms being masked. It leads to, late diagnoses and especially too also, right, in our communities, there's this big value on education, right? Like
Mm.
you need to apply yourself and do well and make us proud, and so there is this element of like, well, I need to do well. And so in the effort of doing well in school, even teachers are overlooking, well, this kid is doing well, right?
Mm.
Without knowing that behind the scenes, I'm actually struggling. And so what do you think are some myths that oftentimes can show up in the Latina community? What are some myths about ADHD that I know people tend to believe that maybe that should be debunked?
Yeah, I mean, I think we were already mentioning a few of them, right? The idea that mental health or any type of services that you receive from a therapist or a psychiatrist is because there's something wrong with you that you need to be fixed, that eso es para los locos. And I think culturally, sometimes there's the experience of swiping it under the rug. No le digas a esta persona, no hables de las cosas de la casa, don't talk about what's going on at home, because then as a community, I think we really value our relationships with our community. So we care a lot about what they think of us. But then it can lead to this feelings of shame of like, don't tell people you have this issue. Don't talk about your mental health to others because that shows that there's something wrong with you, that there's a problem, when really having ADHD is not a problem. You're not somebody who needs to be fixed. Yes, there's symptoms that could be managed better with certain tools and strategies, systems in place to help you navigate this neurotypical world that just continuously is like super fast paced and very distracting, which makes ADHD harder for like the executive functioning. But I think that that's one of those myths is like, no, getting help for your mental health, talking to a psychiatrist or a psychologist or therapist, it's not para los locos. It is very much for everyone. And I think also the myth that you have to wait until something is extremely bad for you to get that help. I think a lot of people have this myth that in order to see a therapist or a psychiatrist, you have to be in a really bad place, when you can want to go to therapy because you notice that maybe you're experiencing imposter phenomenon, or you're experiencing low self-esteem, or you're noticing that it's hard for you to want to make time for certain goals in your life. And just because these goals aren't impacting your livelihood or your financial well-being doesn't mean you can't go to therapy to get support. Or navigating relationships if you're feeling invalidated because they dismiss you at home about the ADHD symptoms. And I think another myth is the labels that we've been talking about. I think those are ones that we definitely want to address, because being told that you're distraída or distraído, that you're eres flojo, ponte las pilas, o no pasa nada, those kinds of messages, at least for people who have ADHD, get ingrained. Whether you're conscious of it or not, it starts to turn into your self talk. And I think that part of being able to challenge those myths, that it's not just about poniéndote las pilas, like, yes, work hard, strive for your goals. That's what we're here for in life, is to, have goals that align with our values, and enjoy life as much as we can to feel accomplished and satisfied. We can want that for ourselves and work hard, and still want to feel validated that sometimes it's really challenging, and that sometimes it just sucks when we don't meet our goals, and being okay to sit with that.
I agree with you 100%. And I was about to share those labels as well, like, eres malcriado or mal portado, um, meaning you're misbehaved. Um, all of that, all of those labels are, yeah, they're not accurate depictions, right, of what someone with ADHD is going through. And I think that really uh, puts it into, like you said, this harboring these negative self-talk or negative associations, and it really presents ADHD more as like um more as like these behaviors are intentional. You must have done
Yeah.
something to cause this, right? And so those associations can really be internalized, can really impact a person with ADHD's self-esteem. And it's so important, in the Latina community, in our families, with our friends, to learn a little bit more about ADHD. And if you're able to, identify the symptoms of ADHD and identify, maybe the question can be more like, how can I support you, rather than you're wrong, right? Or you need to fix your behavior.
Yeah.
How can we do this together, right?
That's
How can we,
right.
right?
Yeah. I agree with you. I think being able to have that support system in place makes such a difference. And I recognize that sometimes we don't have that support system in place. Maybe it's because the people around us just don't get it. They don't want to understand. They don't want to accept that mental health is real. And so then it gets very lonely. And I think that when the support system doesn't feel as strong, going to therapy is an opportunity to connect with somebody who can help with, letting you see, okay, how do we set boundaries with these people who don't understand ADHD, or who are choosing to not understand because they're judging you.
Yeah, absolutely. And creating a safe space for these conversations is so important, so that, so that we can talk about this,
Yeah.
right? So, like, if we're not talking about it, like you said, it goes pushed under the rug.
Mm-hmm.
And there is no such thing as talking about solutions or possible support for an ADHD condition. um we're not, because we're not looking at the problem, right? And sometimes that's why I was inspired, right, to call this open conversaciones abiertas, right? Open conversations, because it's important to talk about this honestly, right? There's so much shame if I talk about this. What does it have to say about me? What does it have to say about my community? But if we talk about it from a stance of like support, empathy, connection, these conversations can be very healing.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that they definitely can be very healing when you have a safe space to do it in, or you're just learning from other folks who have an understanding about what ADHD is and want to support. And I think also, aside from this layer of, the cultural stigma with mental health and not understanding this invisible disability of ADHD, we think about also the layer of society as a whole and how our community, when we're in these school systems, if you're a Black or brown kid, you're going to be labeled as having some kind of conduct disorder instead of ADHD, or you're labeled as like the anxious kid, which, yes, maybe you have anxiety and ADHD, but then if the ADHD isn't diagnosed and it's just treated as anxiety, these schools don't know how to provide the accommodations because there's a piece missing in understanding one's mental health. And unfortunately, when we think specifically with Black and brown boys, if they're constantly being labeled as malcriados, both at school and at home, that puts them at a very high risk of being in the school to prison pipeline, where then they
Mm-hmm.
don't have the confidence at school, they're getting in trouble, then you're going to be at risk of being sent to detention, getting suspended, and it just escalates. And then when we think about women, we get told as Latinas, like, portate bien, or these messages of like, just be this quiet little girl who follows instructions and doesn't speak out of turn. And then a lot of women with ADHD overcompensate and do well academically, but are struggling internally and are trying to navigate managing the burnout that comes with the overcompensation. So I think just aside from it impacting it from a like a cultural level, we have to also think about systemically that kids who come from these marginalized ethnic and racial minorities are also being labeled in ways that schools or systems don't understand. And it can put them at risk for really challenging trajectories into adulthood.
Yeah, this really makes me think about how important it is to have these conversations in like schools, right? And
Mm,
in different organizations, communities that are directly seeing youth on their day to day to kind of better understand, right? Even the school system is already like tailored to neurotypical students, and it's very also tailored in this element of you need to do well. We're going
mm,
to do these standardized tests where if you don't do well, you're going into detention, like you said. And so mislabeling too, right? Like the ADHD behaviors or symptoms as this student needs correction,
yeah,
rather than, all right, how do we accommodate the student, right?
that's right.
Um, and so you brought up a really good point about just this, how the system too really impacts um, um, sensitivity around ADHD. I just recall like you were saying that women overcompensate, how I overcompensated, and in a lot of ways, yeah, I did well, but what I really struggled with was like the more like executive functioning, like I wasn't great at sports. I wasn't great at like coordinating in like the band or things like that. Like I wasn't great at like that type of stuff. I was good like books and learning were my favorite thing because I just wasn't great about at the other or I guess I don't know, maybe practical stuff. And so I was labeled as you're not chispa, you're not alert, or you're awkward,
Mm,
right? And yeah, or and I was even excluded because I wasn't good at these other things that the other kids were good at.
Yeah.
um and so even like I even experienced some minimal bullying from teachers growing up, and also classmates. And so that was, that label of no eres chispa, like it was very hurtful. And to this day, it's still kind of hurtful. And I try my best to not show that that I'm not chispa, or that I'm not like, I try my best to not show that.
Yeah.
But sometimes it is hard because I did forget about that thing, or I didn't see you pass by because I was looking at this other thing, right? Like I didn't really mean to ignore you, or whatever that was, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know how to do salsa, like, but I enjoy the music. And so those things, like, it can be like hurtful because it's not like you're going out of your way to do that. You're just you just struggle with that.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think you're right. Making that distinction that how ADHD shows up in these different spaces or relationships or communication, it's not intentional. It's not like it's an excuse. I think when you're really aware that, like, oh, this wasn't intentional, and then you're also working towards trying to figure out how to communicate that to people so that there is more compassion and empathy, then it does help these relationships, and it helps people have more awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is hope, right? Like, there is hope, and there are tools that people can utilize
Yes.
to manage their ADHD, right? And so, would you like to share, Janice, maybe one of the tools that you share with your clients, or that you share with, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for asking. I agree with you. I think there's so many tools, and I get so excited to talk about those different tools. But one I think that has been really great is Goblin tools. So if you just go on Google or you open up your web browser and type in Goblin tools, it's a website that it is, they use AI, but what I love about it is that you just type in a task that you want to do. Let's say you got to go pick up your medication at the pharmacy. So you type in pick up medication from a pharmacy, and then you click this little button that looks like a wand, and it automatically breaks down the steps. And so, one of the things that I've noticed with my clients who have ADHD is it can get very overwhelming very quickly to start thinking about all the steps that go into doing a task. And then it gets discouraging. And because that's overwhelming and discouraging, then it's avoided. Or sometimes distractibility, forgetfulness gets in the way of doing this task that you know is important, which is to go get your meds at the pharmacy. So, Goblin Tools is super great. You can just add whatever task you have and it'll break down the steps for you. And then, my personal favorite is there's a section where you can also write your ingredients, like what ingredients you have in your fridge or in your cabinets, what cooking tools or utensils you have, and you write all of that out, and it will generate a recipe for you. And I've tested out some of the recipes.
Wow, that is
Like,
so cool.
I,
That is so cool. I just want to say that I love AI. Like, there's so much stigma too around AI, and
yeah,
yeah, you have to be careful with its accuracy,
you're
but
right.
it is so helpful, right? Like, in older times, you used to take like hours developing an idea or figuring out something, and now just using AI supportive tools
Mm,
and apps that incorporate AI, even like Headspace incorporates AI, which is a mental health app.
mm,
um so the tool I have to share is kind of old school, but I think it works. It's developing a declutter schedule, but with self-compassion.
mm,
So a lot of times when with ADHD, right, there's so much overwhelm about organizing your space or decluttering it, so to speak. And there is a lot of like we were talking about the self-criticism. I'm messy, I'm disorganized, or you start like really like feeling overwhelmed when you look at, what needs to be organized. So I would just say, like, whenever you start a task, maybe identify two affirmations or two mantras, like, I will take this at my own space, or how can I make this easier?
Mm.
Like, just different statements so that you can feel like more comfortable with yourself to get through the task.
Yeah.
And then develop like a declutter schedule. And maybe you want to use Goblin, right, to identify the categories that you need to declutter,
Yeah.
and then just start with one thing at a time. Like, maybe you time block and you say, this Saturday morning, I'm just going to focus on my sock drawer,
Mm.
for 30 minutes. I'm
Mm-hmm.
just going to focus on this. I'm not going to move over to the other things. I'm just going to focus on that. And you could just like categorize, right? Like room, kitchen, and just focus on one thing at a time and start small. Because what
Yeah.
happens is you get overwhelmed, right? Like you have this big task and you think you need to do it all, but if you break it down into smaller tasks, and then you are kind with yourself while you do that, you'll get through it.
That's right. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm so excited for hopefully whoever is watching to try out one of these tools.
Yeah, me too. Well, this has been such a wonderful conversation, Janice. I really love that we're both Latina clinicians, and we both like understand, hey, how it is to have lived experiences, right, in the Latina community. And also we work with clients who have ADHD, right? And so I let's just end by sharing, how can people find you? Are there any offerings that you have for the ADHD community right now?
Yeah, thank you so much. So you can find me on my Instagram at Dr. Janice Castro. I am also on the Latine ADHD podcast. So I am the host and producer of that podcast. You can find me on there. I share a lot of ADHD tips and strategies and psychoeducation. And also, I welcome anyone who has been diagnosed with ADHD that identifies within the BIPOC community. So if you're Black, Indigenous, person of color, and you want to share your story about having ADHD and how your journey has been, I think it's a great podcast to be able to amplify those voices, because whoever is listening who may be questioning if they have ADHD, just got diagnosed with ADHD, or struggling with their ADHD, can feel validated. The way that we're going to destigmatize mental health when it comes to ADHD is when we recognize that this isn't something abnormal. This isn't something that there's something wrong. The more we hear stories, then the more validating and normalizes it. So I welcome anyone who'd want to be a guest, as well as I have a newsletter that people can sign up for. So I also share some ADHD tips on there, and you can stay up to date with the podcast episode releases on my newsletter. And I am a speaker. I can come to organizations and companies to talk about, motivation, perseverance, and being able to talk about Latine community and ADHD. So breaking the barriers and building resilience.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful, Janice. It sounds like you're doing amazing work.
Thank
Um, And as for myself, like I said earlier, I work with youth, and so this is my kind of individual professional page where I share different mental wellness tools, and you can follow me on here. But if if you have, if you know of anyone like a teen, young adult, or family that needs support through counseling in the DC, Maryland, and Florida area, you can follow my practice Instagram is just Child Haven Counseling, or go to my website and request services. And yeah, I work with youth, and I do work with youth who have ADHD as well. And those are the services that I provide. Over the summer, I'm going to have the ADHD skills group for young adults. I had it last year and I got really great feedback, so I'm going to rerun it, and I hope you check it out. And similar to Janice, I also uh, do speaking engagements, and I have experience partnering with organizations and sharing mental wellness tools to their members, their employees. But I'm also, open to having more of these talks. So if you want to, invite me in to do a speaking engagement, you can just reach me on this main page. So I'm really excited to have collaborated with Janice, or Dr. Castro, I should say. And it was great having you, Janice. Thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Bye.
Bye.